3 lawyers walked into the conference room behind my mother, and I understood, before anyone said a single word, exactly how long she'd been planning this. My name is Vanessa. I'm 32 years old, an engineer at a structural firm in Denver, and on a gray Tuesday morning 11 days after my father's funeral, I sat at the head of a polished conference table in Gerald Voss's office, watching my mother Carol settle into a chair across from me with the particular composed satisfaction of a woman who believed she'd already won. I didn't realize this was going to be a formal proceeding, I said, looking at the 3 unfamiliar attorneys arranging folders in front of my mother and my stepfather, Dennis. We just want to make sure everything's handled properly, Carol said, smiling in the careful, performative way she'd perfected over the decades I'd spent watching her smile at everyone except me like that. Your father's estate is complicated. We thought it best to come prepared. I didn't know yet, sitting in that conference room with my hands folded carefully on the table, that prepared meant a formal legal demand for 80% of my father's $800,000 estate, an estate he'd spent the final 2 years of his life specifically protecting from exactly this kind of demand. I didn't know that within 3 weeks of that meeting, my mother and stepfather would be standing in handcuffs outside the very house they were trying to take from me, after deciding that legal pressure wasn't enough and fire might succeed where paperwork had failed. I just knew, watching my mother's lawyers lay out their documents with practiced efficiency, that I was glad I hadn't come to this meeting alone. Before we begin, I said, reaching into my bag, I should mention I brought my own attorney. Gerald Voss walked in a moment later, calm and unhurried, carrying a folder considerably thicker than anything currently sitting on the table in front of my mother. To understand why that moment in the conference room felt less like a surprise and more like the conclusion of something I'd been quietly bracing for my entire adult life, you need to understand the family I grew up inside of, because none of what happened that Tuesday came from nowhere. My parents divorced when I was 7. My father, Edward, was an aerospace engineer, methodical, quiet, the kind of man who showed love through consistency rather than declarations, who never missed a school recital even after the divorce reshaped our family into something smaller and more complicated. My mother remarried 2 years later, to Dennis, a contractor with an easy laugh and a much harder edge underneath it that revealed itself slowly, over years, the way most concerning things in families do. Dennis had a daughter from his first marriage, Christina, a year older than me, and from almost the moment our blended family formed, I understood without anyone explicitly telling me that Christina occupied a different category in that household than I did. She was Dennis's daughter and, increasingly, Carol's favorite, treated with an ease and warmth that I rarely received, even though I was, biologically, my mother's only child. I don't think, looking back now with the clarity that comes from years of distance and eventually therapy, that my mother set out consciously to favor her stepdaughter over her own daughter. I think it happened the way most slow betrayals happen, gradually, through 1,000 small choices that each seemed reasonable in isolation. Christina got comforted first during arguments because she cried more readily. I got told to be the mature one because I usually was. Over time, that asymmetry calcified into something that felt, by my teenage years, less like an accident and more like an arrangement everyone in the house had silently agreed to accept me. My father remained a steady, separate source of warmth throughout my childhood, weekend visits that felt like exhaling after a week of careful self-management, summers at his lake cabin where nobody needed me to be smaller than I actually was. He never remarried. He built a quiet, solitary life around his work and, increasingly, around me, and as I got older, our relationship deepened into something that felt less like visitation and more like genuine partnership. My blind spot, the one I carried for most of my adult life without fully examining it, was a kind of stubborn underestimation, not of my mother's capacity for unfairness, which I'd witnessed plenty of evidence for over the years, but of how far she and Dennis would actually be willing to go once real money entered the equation. I'd seen my mother manipulate, guilt-trip, and favor Christina over me in 100 small domestic ways. I never imagined, even after everything, that she'd escalate to attorneys, harassment campaigns, and ultimately something far more dangerous than either. My father was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer 2 years before that conference room meeting, a brutal, fast-moving illness that gave us, in the end, less time than either of us wanted to prepare for what was coming. I moved temporarily back to Denver from the engineering job I'd taken in Seattle, splitting my time between work calls and his bedside, and it was during those final 18 months that I first met Gerald Voss, my father's longtime attorney and, increasingly, something closer to family. Your father wants to talk to you about some decisions he's making, Gerald told me, about 8 months before my father died, in the careful, measured tone lawyers use when they're delivering something heavier than the words themselves suggest. I didn't know, sitting down across from my father in his study that afternoon, surrounded by the smell of old books and the particular quality of late afternoon light through his window, that he was about to spend the next several months methodically, deliberately building legal protections around an inheritance he already suspected, with the specific clarity of a man who'd watched my mother operate for over 2 decades, would otherwise become a battlefield the moment he was gone. I know your mother, my father said simply, the day he first told me about the trust he was setting up. I know exactly what she'll do once I'm not here to complicate things for her. I'm not going to let her do it. I didn't fully understand, in that moment, how right he would turn out to be, or how close his preparation would come to being tested by something far more extreme than the legal pressure he'd actually anticipated. The 18 months of my father's illness passed in the particular blur that anyone who's cared for a dying parent recognizes immediately: hospital corridors that started to feel more familiar than my own apartment, the strange new vocabulary of oncology, the quiet negotiation between hope and preparation that never fully resolves itself either direction until the end actually arrives. My mother visited him exactly 3 times during those 18 months. I want to state that plainly, without embellishment, because the contrast matters for everything that follows. 3 visits, each one brief, each one, I understood only later, putting pieces together, apparently more focused on gauging the state of his finances than on any genuine concern for his well-being. How's he doing, really? She asked me during the second visit, in the hospital cafeteria, her voice carrying a practiced concern that didn't quite reach her eyes. Has he said anything about arrangements for after? Mom, he has cancer. Can we maybe not talk about his estate while he's still alive? I'm just asking because I care, Vanessa, she said, in the wounded tone she'd always used whenever I pushed back against something she wanted. You don't have to be so cold about it. I remember feeling, in that moment, a familiar mixture of guilt and frustration, the specific exhausting combination my mother had triggered in me my entire life, where her own behavior somehow always managed to make me feel like the unreasonable one for noticing it. I apologized, reflexively, the way I'd been trained to since childhood, and changed the subject, telling myself I was probably reading too much calculation into a mother's natural concern about her ex-husband's situation. That, I understand now, was the first meaningful misread of the entire story, not catastrophic on its own, but part of a long pattern where I gave my mother's behavior the most generous possible interpretation, even when the evidence increasingly suggested something far less innocent. Dennis called me directly only once during that period, a conversation I found odd enough at the time that I mentioned it to my father afterward. Just wanted to check in, Dennis said, his tone overly casual in a way that immediately put me on alert. How's your dad's health insurance situation? Does he have things squared away financially, or is this going to be a mess for everyone? Why would that be your business, Dennis? No reason, he said, too quickly, an evasion I noted and then, in the rhythm of a lifetime spent minimizing red flags from this particular family, set aside without pushing further. My father, when I mentioned both conversations to him, didn't seem surprised at all, which, looking back, should have told me more than it did at the time about exactly how clearly he already understood what was coming. They're already circling, he said simply. I expected as much. Circling for what, Dad? You're still here. For what comes after, he said, with a calm that I mistook, in the moment, for simple resignation rather than the early stages of careful, deliberate strategy. I've already started talking to Gerald about how to handle it. Gerald Voss became, over those 18 months, a far more significant presence in my life than I'd anticipated, not just my father's attorney, but increasingly someone who treated my own well-being as part of his actual responsibility, rather than incidental to handling my father's affairs. Your father's putting together something fairly comprehensive, Gerald told me, about 5 months before my father's death, the 2 of us sitting in his office while my father rested at home. A trust structure, specific protective language, documentation of his intentions. He wants to make sure that whatever happens with your mother after he's gone, you're not left exposed to it. Exposed to what, exactly? She's not entitled to anything from his estate. They've been divorced for 25 years. Legally, no, Gerald said carefully. But legal entitlement and what people attempt aren't always the same thing, especially when significant money is involved and family relationships are already complicated. Your father wants to be thorough. I appreciated the preparation in the moment without fully internalizing how necessary he apparently believed it to be. I want to be honest about that, even with my father's calm warnings, even with Gerald's careful language, some part of me still believed, right up until the conference room, that whatever conflict eventually emerged would stay within the bounds of family tension rather than escalating into anything resembling an actual legal assault, let alone anything more dangerous than that. My father died on a cold morning in February, 14 months after his diagnosis, with Gerald having visited just 3 days earlier to finalize the last remaining details of the trust. I sat with him in his final hours, the hospital room quiet except for the soft mechanical rhythm of monitors, and felt, even through the devastating grief of losing him, a strange undercurrent of gratitude for how deliberately he'd prepared for everything that would come after. I didn't know, in those final hours, exactly how soon everything that would come after would actually arrive. My mother called 4 days after the funeral, not to check on me, not to offer condolences beyond a perfunctory opening line, but to ask, with a warmth in her voice I hadn't heard directed at me in years, whether we could get together as a family soon, to talk things through. Talk through what, exactly? I asked, already feeling something tighten in my chest at the unfamiliar gentleness of her tone. Everything, sweetheart. The estate, the house, how we move forward as a family now that your father's gone. A pause, calculated, I understood much later, for exactly the right amount of warmth. I know things have been hard between us. I think this could actually be a chance for us to come back together. I wanted, despite everything, despite decades of evidence suggesting otherwise, to believe that sentence. There's a particular vulnerability that grief creates, a hunger for connection, for warmth, for anyone willing to offer comfort during a period when you feel unmoored from everything familiar, and my mother's sudden gentleness arrived precisely when that vulnerability was at its highest. I told myself, against my own better judgment, that perhaps losing my father had genuinely shifted something in her. That perhaps this really was an opening toward the relationship I'd quietly wanted my entire life. That hope, I understand now, was the second meaningful mistake of this story, not because hoping for reconciliation is inherently foolish, but because I let that hope outpace the actual evidence available to me, the same pattern I'd been running since the hospital cafeteria conversation months earlier. The calls intensified over the following week, not just from my mother but from Dennis, and increasingly, in tone, from Christina as well. Texts that arrived with strange, performative warmth, references to family healing and moving forward together, that felt, even as I tried to take them at face value, oddly scripted, as if everyone involved had been given the same talking points to repeat. We should all sit down together, Christina texted, 3 days after my mother's call. I know things have been weird between us for years, but I really think losing your dad could be a chance for us to actually become a real family for once. I stared at that text for a long time, something uneasy stirring beneath the surface of my grief. Christina and I had never been close, not hostile exactly, but distant in the particular way that step-siblings sometimes remain distant even after decades under the same roof, our relationship shaped more by our parents' dynamics than by anything organic between us. The sudden warmth felt foreign enough that I noticed it, even through my own desire to believe it might be genuine. I mentioned the pattern to Gerald during a call about an unrelated estate matter. They're being unusually warm, I told him. All of them, suddenly, right after the funeral. It feels strange. Gerald's voice, when he responded, carried a careful weight I hadn't heard from him before. Vanessa, I want to be direct with you, because I think it matters. Your father specifically anticipated this exact pattern. He told me, more than once, that if anything happened to him, your mother would likely attempt reconciliation first, as a way of getting closer to the estate discussions before escalating to anything more direct. He really thought that specifically? He knew her for over 2 decades, Gerald said. He didn't say it bitterly, for what it's worth. He said it almost sadly, like a man describing weather patterns he'd long since stopped being surprised by. I sat with that conversation for several days afterward, turning over the uncomfortable possibility that my father had understood my mother's likely behavior with more clarity than I'd been willing to extend her myself, even after everything. I didn't want to believe it. Some part of me, even at 32, with decades of evidence already accumulated, still wanted my mother's sudden warmth to be real rather than strategic. The first concrete sign that something more serious was coming arrived 10 days after the funeral, in the form of a registered letter from an attorney's office I didn't recognize, addressed to me directly, requesting a family meeting to discuss the equitable distribution of the late Edward Hale's estate. The letter referenced my mother and Dennis by name as the requesting parties and used language, equitable distribution, fair consideration of all family members' contributions, that felt clinical and rehearsed in a way that contradicted entirely the warm, reconciliatory tone of the phone calls and texts that had preceded it. I called Gerald immediately, reading him the letter over the phone. "This is exactly what your father anticipated," he said, after a long pause. "I'd like you to come into my office tomorrow. I think it's time we prepared properly for whatever's coming." "How bad do you think this actually is, Gerald?" "I think," he said carefully, "that your mother has spent the last 10 days building emotional goodwill specifically so that when this meeting happens, you'll feel obligated to be generous, out of some renewed sense of family connection. I think the warmth and the legal letter are part of the same strategy, not contradictory impulses. And I think we should make sure you walk into that meeting with at least as much preparation as they clearly have." I didn't know yet exactly what preparation would ultimately require, or how close my mother and Dennis would eventually come to escalating far beyond anything either Gerald or I initially anticipated. I only knew, hanging up that call, that whatever fragile hope I'd allowed myself to feel over the preceding 10 days had been, just as Gerald suspected, carefully and deliberately manufactured. Gerald's office, the next morning, felt different than it had during the quieter months of my father's illness, more urgent, more focused, the particular energy of someone preparing for a confrontation rather than simply managing routine affairs. "I want to walk you through exactly what your father set up," he said, spreading documents across his desk. "The trust is irrevocable. It was funded entirely before his death, which means it isn't technically part of his probate estate at all. It exists separately, already legally yours, regardless of what any will contest or family negotiation produces. So they can't actually take it? Even if they push hard at this meeting?" "Legally, no," Gerald said. "But I want to be honest with you about something important. Legal reality and what people are willing to attempt aren't always the same thing. Your mother's attorneys may not fully understand the trust structure yet. They may believe there's more room to negotiate than there actually is. And people who believe they're owed something, when faced with the reality that they're not getting it, sometimes don't respond rationally." I thought about that warning longer than I expected to in the moment, though I didn't yet have a framework for how seriously to take it. "What's the worst-case scenario here, realistically?" "Sustained legal harassment, most likely," Gerald said. "Possibly attempts to contest the will itself, claiming undue influence or diminished capacity at the time your father set up the trust, which won't succeed, given how thoroughly we documented his mental clarity throughout the process, but which can be exhausting and expensive to fight even when you're certain to win." He paused. "I'd also recommend, frankly, that you have a security system installed at the house your father left you, just as a precaution. I don't say that to alarm you unnecessarily. I say it because thoroughness matters when this much money and this much resentment are both in play." I followed his advice without fully understanding, at the time, how necessary it would turn out to be. A security company installed cameras at the corners of the house the following week, a quiet, almost mundane afternoon of technicians running wires, the kind of errand that felt, in the moment, like simple precaution rather than the beginning of evidence that would eventually matter enormously. The harassment, when it began in earnest, started subtly enough that I initially attributed individual incidents to ordinary family tension rather than a coordinated campaign. Texts from my mother that shifted, within the same conversation, from warm reminiscence to pointed comments about how, your father would have wanted us all taken care of, not just you. A social media post from Christina, vague enough to avoid naming me directly but specific enough that anyone who knew our family could parse exactly what she meant, about some people inheriting everything while others get left with nothing, even after years of being treated like family. I screenshotted everything. Gerald had advised me to, the week before, in language I hadn't fully appreciated until the screenshots started accumulating into something that, viewed together, painted a far more deliberate picture than any single message could on its own. "This is escalating faster than I expected," Gerald said, reviewing the screenshots I'd forwarded him about 2 weeks after the registered letter arrived. I think we should move the meeting up, rather than letting them control the timeline entirely. It was during this period, gathering screenshots, reviewing trust documents with Gerald, installing security cameras at a house I hadn't yet fully processed as mine, that Aunt Linda, my mother's older sister, called me directly, her voice carrying a hesitancy I'd never heard from her before. "I don't know if I should be telling you this," she said, "but I think you deserve to know. Your mother's been talking to Uncle Robert and me about the inheritance. She's been saying you manipulated your father while he was sick, that you isolated him from the rest of the family to secure everything for yourself." I felt something cold move through my chest hearing that. "That's not remotely true, Linda. You know how much time Mom actually spent with him during his illness? Almost none." "I know," Linda said, quietly. "I think some part of me has known for a while that your mother's version of things isn't always accurate. I just didn't want to believe she'd go this far. I wanted you to know what she's saying, in case it comes up at whatever meeting's being planned." I thanked her, genuinely, understanding even as we spoke that Linda's discomfort, her willingness to break from whatever narrative my mother was building, might eventually matter considerably more than either of us fully understood in that moment. I didn't yet know how directly her honesty would end up factoring into what followed. The formal meeting request arrived 3 days later, a date, a time, Gerald Voss's own conference room selected as the venue at my mother's insistence, framed in her message to me as a gesture of respect toward your father's people, though I understood, by then, that the choice was almost certainly strategic, an attempt to seem reasonable and accommodating before the actual demands were revealed. I spent the days leading up to that meeting reviewing every document Gerald had prepared, rehearsing, mentally, every version of the conversation I could imagine unfolding. I want to be honest that even with all that preparation, even with the trust structure legally airtight and the harassment thoroughly documented, some part of me still hoped, against every accumulated piece of evidence, that the meeting itself might somehow resolve more gently than the build-up suggested it would. I didn't yet understand how wrong that hope would turn out to be, or how much further than legal pressure my mother and Dennis were actually prepared to go once the meeting failed to produce the outcome they wanted. The conference room felt smaller than I remembered from my previous visits, crowded now with my mother, Dennis, Christina, and 3 attorneys I didn't recognize, their folders arranged with the careful precision of people who'd rehearsed this moment extensively. "I didn't realize this was going to be a formal proceeding," I said, settling into the chair Gerald had specifically suggested I take, at the head of the table, deliberately, a positioning choice he'd explained beforehand as a way of denying my mother's side the visual dominance they'd clearly planned around. "We just want to make sure everything's handled properly," Carol said, smiling. "Your father's estate is complicated. We thought it best to come prepared." "Before we begin," I said, "I should mention I brought my own attorney." Gerald walked in a moment later, settling beside me with the same unhurried calm he'd carried through every conversation since my father's diagnosis, and I watched my mother's composed smile flicker, just slightly, at the sight of the folder he carried, visibly thicker than anything currently arranged in front of her own attorneys. The lead attorney on my mother's side, a sharp-featured man named Patterson, opened with practiced efficiency. "We're here to discuss what we believe is an inequitable distribution of the late Mr. Hale's assets. Our position is that Mrs. Whitfield," he gestured toward my mother, "and her family contributed significantly to Mr. Hale's life and well-being in ways that warrant meaningful financial recognition, regardless of the formal terms of his will." "What exactly are you asking for?" I said, my voice steadier than I expected, though my pulse was loud in my own ears. "Our proposal," Patterson said, sliding a document across the table, "is for 80% of the estate's total value to be redistributed to Mrs. Whitfield and her immediate family, with the remaining 20% retained by Ms. Hale." The number landed in the room with a kind of absurd weight, 80%, demanded by a woman who'd visited her dying ex-husband exactly 3 times in 14 months, who hadn't spoken to me with anything resembling genuine warmth in years before this sudden, manufactured reconciliation campaign began. "On what basis?" Gerald asked, his voice calm, almost conversational, though I could feel the controlled precision underneath it. "Mrs. Whitfield was married to Mr. Hale for many years," Patterson said. "There's a reasonable argument for ongoing equitable interest in assets accumulated, in part, during that period of the marriage." "They divorced 25 years ago," I said. Everything in that estate was earned, invested, and grown entirely after the divorce, over decades, on my father's own income from a career he built independently of her. The emotional contributions of a long marriage don't simply expire with a legal decree, my mother said, her voice taking on a wounded quality I recognized immediately from a lifetime of similar performances. I supported him for years, Vanessa. I helped build the foundation that allowed him to succeed later. That matters, even if you don't want to acknowledge it. You left him, I said quietly. And then you spent the next 25 years building a life with Dennis that had nothing to do with my father, until the moment he got sick and you suddenly remembered you were owed something. Dennis spoke up for the first time, his earlier easy charm entirely absent now, replaced by something harder. Watch your tone with your mother. Watch your tone with me, I said. In a room you came to specifically to take 80% of an inheritance you have no legal claim to whatsoever. Gerald, sensing the moment had arrived for the substantive response, opened his folder. I'd like to walk everyone through some relevant documentation, he said. First, the trust structure itself, which was fully funded and irrevocable before Mr. Hale's death, placing these assets outside the probate estate entirely and therefore outside any claim based on marital contribution, since the marriage in question ended decades before the trust existed. He slid copies across the table, watching Patterson's expression shift as he reviewed the documents, the careful confidence of the opening minutes giving way to something more uncertain. Second, Gerald continued, documentation of Mr. Hale's mental capacity and clarity throughout the trust's creation, including evaluations from 2 independent physicians, specifically obtained to preempt any future claim of undue influence or diminished capacity. Another set of documents, sliding across the polished table. Third, a comprehensive record of communications over the past 3 weeks, demonstrating a coordinated harassment campaign directed at my client following her father's death, including social media posts, text messages, and voicemails that I believe a court would find relevant to any broader assessment of this family's conduct during this period. The room had gone very quiet by this point, my mother's attorneys exchanging glances that confirmed what I'd begun to suspect. They hadn't fully understood the trust structure before walking in, hadn't anticipated the depth of preparation arrayed against them. This is harassment, my mother said, her composure finally cracking, her voice rising. You're trying to paint me as some kind of villain, when all I'm asking for is fair recognition after decades of marriage. You're asking for 80% of an estate you have no legal claim to, I said, from a man you visited 3 times while he was dying. I have the visitor logs from the hospital, Mom, if you'd like Gerald to add those to the file as well. Patterson conferred quietly with his colleagues for almost a full minute, the silence in the room thick with the particular discomfort of people watching a confident plan collapse in real time. I think, he finally said, we may need to revisit our position, given this documentation. There's nothing to revisit, Carol said sharply, turning on her own attorney with a fury that startled even me. You told me this would work. Mrs. Whitfield, given the trust structure your daughter's counsel has just presented, I don't believe we have a viable claim to pursue further, Patterson said carefully. I'd recommend we conclude this meeting. My mother stood abruptly, her chair scraping loudly against the floor, her careful composure entirely gone now, replaced by something raw and furious. This isn't over, she said, looking directly at me. You think you've won something here, but you have no idea what you've actually done. I think I've successfully protected what my father specifically built protections around, I said, my voice steady despite the way my heart was pounding. I think that's exactly what he intended. Christina, who'd remained silent through most of the meeting, looked at me with an expression I couldn't fully parse, something between embarrassment and genuine discomfort. Mom, maybe we should just. Don't, Carol snapped at her, and the 3 of them gathered their things and left without another word, Dennis's jaw tight with a barely controlled anger that, looking back now, I understand I should have taken far more seriously than I did in that immediate moment of relief. Gerald and I sat in the conference room afterward, the adrenaline of the confrontation slowly draining out of my body, replaced by an exhausted, uncertain relief. That went about as well as it could have, Gerald said. Do you think it's really over? He considered the question longer than I expected, something careful in his expression. Legally, yes. Emotionally, for them, I don't know. People who've convinced themselves they're entitled to something don't always accept defeat gracefully, even when the defeat is completely unambiguous. I didn't know, leaving Gerald's office that afternoon, how quickly and how dangerously his caution would turn out to be justified. The fire alarm at the house went off at 2:47 in the morning, 11 days after the meeting in Gerald's conference room, a detail I know precisely because I'd grown obsessive, in the days following the confrontation, about checking the security app on my phone before bed, a habit Gerald's earlier warning about people who don't accept defeat gracefully had apparently embedded deep enough that I never quite stopped half expecting something. I wasn't living in the house yet. I'd been staying at my own apartment across town while slowly working through what to do with my father's belongings, visiting only periodically to manage paperwork and decide what to keep, which meant the smoke alarm and security system notifications arrived on my phone before I was anywhere near the actual scene. The footage, when I finally reviewed it with shaking hands at 3 in the morning, showed two figures approaching the back of the house just after 2:30, moving with the deliberate, furtive caution of people who believed themselves unobserved. The security cameras Gerald had recommended months earlier, the same cameras I'd almost forgotten were even still actively recording, given how uneventful the weeks since installation had been, captured everything with unsettling clarity: a gas can, a deliberate pour along the base of the back porch, a lighter small flame catching against kindling someone had clearly prepared in advance. I called 911 immediately, my voice shaking in a way it hadn't during the entire conference room confrontation, watching live notifications update on my phone as the fire department responded. The fire itself, thankfully, caught only the porch and a portion of the exterior wall before firefighters arrived and extinguished it. Structural damage, significant but reparable, rather than the total loss it could so easily have become. It was the security footage's clarity, reviewed by police investigators within hours, that identified the two figures beyond any reasonable doubt: my mother and Dennis, their faces caught directly by a camera angle neither of them had apparently anticipated, illuminated clearly enough by a streetlight that no defense attorney would later be able to argue misidentification. I didn't see them arrested. I learned about it the next morning from a detective's phone call, informing me that my mother and stepfather had been taken into custody on arson and conspiracy charges, the footage providing what the lead detective described as about as clean a case as I've seen in 15 years on the job. I sat in my apartment that morning, coffee going cold in front of me, feeling something far more complicated than the straightforward relief I might have expected. Grief, mostly, not for the legal consequences they now faced, which felt entirely earned, but for the final, irreversible confirmation that my mother had been willing to commit actual arson rather than accept losing money she had no legitimate claim to in the first place. Some part of me, even after everything, the harassment, the manufactured reconciliation, the 80% demand in that conference room, had still held on to some small, stubborn hope that she wasn't actually capable of something this extreme. That hope, I understand now, had been its own quiet, persistent blind spot, running underneath everything else throughout this entire story, not naivety about her flaws, which I'd witnessed plenty of evidence for over decades, but a specific underestimation of how far those flaws might actually extend once enough money and enough desperation combined. I'd seen my mother manipulate and favor and harm me in small domestic ways my entire life. I genuinely hadn't believed, until the security footage made it undeniable, that she'd escalate all the way to fire. Aunt Linda called the day after the arrests, her voice thick with a grief I hadn't expected from her, given how much distance had already grown between her and my mother over recent weeks. "I keep thinking about all the years I defended her," Linda said. "All the times I told myself she just had a complicated relationship with you, nothing more serious than ordinary family tension. I should have seen this coming. I should have taken what you and your father always quietly implied about her far more seriously. You couldn't have known she'd actually try to burn a house down, Linda. Nobody could have predicted that specifically." "Maybe not the fire," Linda said. "But the cruelty underneath it? I think some part of all of us knew that was always there. We just kept choosing not to look at it directly, because it was easier." I thought about that conversation for a long time afterward, the specific, painful honesty in it, an admission that the family's collective willingness to minimize my mother's behavior over decades had, in its own quiet way, helped create the conditions where she eventually felt emboldened enough to attempt something this extreme. It wasn't blame I wanted to assign to Linda or Robert or anyone else who'd looked away over the years. It was simply, finally, a clear accounting of how patterns like this actually grow, not through one dramatic moment, but through years of accumulated permission, granted by people too uncomfortable or too conflict-averse to name what they were actually witnessing. The trial process took the better part of a year. I won't pretend it was easy, watching my mother and Dennis face charges in a courtroom, hearing the prosecution lay out, methodically, exactly how deliberate the arson attempt had been, the gas can purchase 2 days earlier with cash, specifically to avoid a credit card trail, the careful timing, chosen because they'd apparently learned, from monitoring my social media, that I wouldn't be staying at the house that particular night, the chilling, almost businesslike efficiency with which two people who'd raised me had planned to destroy a house rather than accept losing a legal battle they'd already lost. They were both convicted, Carol on arson and conspiracy charges, Dennis on the same, plus an additional charge related to the gas can purchase that prosecutors had traced clearly back to him. The sentencing, when it came, felt less like triumph and more like a quiet, exhausted closing of a chapter I'd never imagined would end this way. Christina reached out about 2 months after the sentencing, her message careful and genuinely remorseful in a way that felt different from anything I'd received during the earlier harassment campaign. I know I don't deserve a response, and I'm not asking you to give me one right away or ever. I just want you to know I'm sorry. I went along with things I shouldn't have. I told myself I was just supporting my dad and Carol, but really I think I knew, the whole time, that what we were doing to you was wrong. I'm sorry I didn't say anything when it mattered. I didn't respond for several weeks, needing time to decide what, if anything, I wanted that relationship to become going forward. I eventually wrote back, brief, honest, leaving the door open without rushing through it. Thank you for saying that. I believe you mean it. I'm not ready to know what comes next for us, but I appreciate you saying it plainly, instead of asking me for something. I moved into my father's house 6 months after the fire. Once the repairs to the back porch and exterior wall were finally complete, the new wood slightly lighter in color than the surrounding siding, a small, visible reminder of what had happened that I decided, deliberately, not to have repainted to match perfectly. I wanted that small discrepancy visible, not as an open wound, but as a quiet, permanent acknowledgement of exactly what I'd survived and refused to let define the rest of my life in that house. Gerald and I still talk regularly, though our conversations have shifted, over the past year, from legal strategy into something closer to genuine friendship, occasional dinners, updates on cases and projects, the kind of relationship that develops naturally between people who've been through something significant together and come out the other side with real respect for each other. I think, sometimes, about the version of that conference room meeting where my mother's attorneys had been right, where the trust structure had somehow been less airtight than my father and Gerald had built it to be, where I might have walked away having lost everything he'd spent his final months protecting. I think, more often, about the version of the story where the fire succeeded, where the security cameras hadn't been installed, where I'd been staying at the house that particular night, where the outcome could have been so much worse than property damage in a long, difficult trial. I don't dwell in those alternate versions for long. What actually happened required all of it, my father's foresight, Gerald's preparation, the security cameras installed almost as an afterthought, my own willingness to take warning seriously even when some stubborn part of me wanted desperately to believe my mother incapable of what she eventually proved entirely capable of. I sit on my father's back porch some evenings now, in the slightly mismatched section of new wood, watching the same sunset he used to watch from that exact spot, and feel something I'm only now, a year later, able to name clearly, not triumph over what my mother and Dennis attempted, but a deep, settled gratitude that my father knew her well enough, loved me enough, and prepared thoroughly enough that her worst attempt to take everything from me ended, instead, with her losing everything she actually had left. The most revealing detail in this story isn't the arson itself, it's the 80% figure demanded in that conference room. Not 50, not even a generous-sounding 60. 80% reveals something essential about Carol's psychology. This was never framed, even internally, as a negotiation. It was framed as a near-total claim, the kind of number that only makes sense if you've already convinced yourself the other party has no legitimate right to push back. That number is the clearest evidence in the entire story of how completely Carol had rewritten the moral arithmetic of her own entitlement. What's worth sitting with is how closely the conference room ambush and the arson attempt actually mirror each other in structure, despite their wildly different severity. Both were premeditated. Both depended on Vanessa being caught unprepared. Both ultimately failed for the same underlying reason. Edward had anticipated exactly this pattern of behavior with enough specificity, years in advance, to build defenses that neither legal pressure nor literal fire could overcome. The story's real tension isn't really between Vanessa and her mother, it's between Carol's escalating desperation and a dead man's foresight, and the dead man wins decisively, from beyond the point where he could intervene personally. Aunt Linda's late confession deserves particular attention, because it reframes the entire family system rather than just Carol's individual choices. Her admission, that the family had quietly known about Carol's cruelty for years and simply chosen not to look at it directly, illustrates a pattern far broader than this single inheritance dispute. Enabling rarely requires active participation. It often requires nothing more than years of people choosing comfortable silence over uncomfortable confrontation, and that accumulated silence is part of what allowed Carol to believe, right up until her arrest, that an extreme action like arson might actually succeed. Vanessa's own blind spot, her persistent underestimation of how far her mother might escalate, isn't really a character flaw so much as a measure of how difficult it is to fully believe the worst about someone who raised you, even after decades of smaller evidence pointing in that exact direction. She didn't fail to notice her mother's cruelty. She failed, specifically, to extend that cruelty to its logical extreme until the security footage made the extension undeniable. That's a distinctly different kind of blind spot than simple denial. It's closer to a protective limit on imagination, the mind's reluctance to fully picture a parent capable of attempted arson, even when every other piece of evidence already pointed there. The deepest lesson sitting beneath this story isn't really about inheritance or even about family betrayal in the abstract. It's about the value of preparation that happens before a crisis arrives, built by someone who understood a dangerous pattern clearly enough to act on it in advance, rather than waiting to react once the danger had already materialized. Edward's trust, his medical evaluations, his early conversations with Gerald, none of it was reactive. All of it was preventive, built specifically because he refused to assume the people he loved would behave better than the evidence already suggested they would. What stays with me longest about this story isn't the courtroom, or even the fire, it's the gas can, purchased 2 days in advance with cash, specifically to avoid a paper trail. That small, methodical detail says more about premeditation than almost anything else in this entire account. People don't accidentally plan that carefully. They choose to. I think about how long it can take to fully believe someone is capable of something extreme, even when smaller versions of that same cruelty have already shown themselves for years, quietly, in ways everyone around them chose not to examine too closely. Maybe the real question this story leaves behind isn't whether Carol was always capable of this. Maybe it's simpler, and harder. How many smaller warning signs do we need to see, in someone we love, before we're finally willing to believe the bigger one when it finally arrives?